Good evening, everyone. I'm Kristen Miller-Zohn, Executive Director of Costume Society of America, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Costume Society of America's Conversation on Dress and Oral History with Buermann Wass. This is part of a series of oral histories that we've been doing as part of Conversations on Dress. You can view all of them on our YouTube channel. So Anne, let's dive right in. You've been a member of CSA since 1986, when you began your PhD studies. What led you to pursue your doctorate? Where did you study, and what was your focus?
Well, first I have to say that my husband Jim has always been very supportive through the years. He was in the Navy and we were in Mississippi where he was stationed, but I was beginning to think that I wanted to go back to graduate school. I did some looking and I discovered the University of Maryland. Jim met someone who said, well, then you need to get orders to Washington, D.C., since it's in the suburbs of Washington. So he did. He talked to his detailer. And he was assigned to the Navy Regional Data Automation Center, which in Navy parlance is called NARDAC, at the Washington Navy Yard. And in fall of 1986, I began at the Department of Textiles and Consumer Economics in the College of Human Ecology at the University of Maryland. Unfortunately, the College of Human Ecology was disbanded in 1991. It's really hard for me to separate out CSA people and experiences as they're woven through these years from that very beginning. So I'm going to include some of that involvement as I go along, but I will address some of it specifically later when you ask me about that. Core courses in the department included statistics, economics, and chemistry. My supporting area was history and decorative arts, and I did take a 2-semester sequence of the history of decorative arts with Barbara Carson. Two of our professors in the department were Dr. Clarita Anderson and Dr. Joe Paoletti. And one of the very first courses we took from them was the historiography of costume and textiles. They co-taught that. Jean Parsons, by the way, was in that class. She was actually also starting her doctorate at the same time.
Jean Parsons, in fact, CSA fellow.
Yes, and the professors definitely encouraged us to join CSA. In fact, that fall, Joe Paoletti got a van and took us on a trip to the Mercer Museum in Doylestown for, I'm going to use the names of the regions, even though we were going by numbers then because they're easier to remember. That was run by the Mid-Atlantic of the CSA. And that's where I first met Elizabeth Brown, who would go on to have quite an influence on me in CSA. She was talking about her sewing machine collection. During the course of my graduate studies, PhD students were required to do an additional research project as well as our doctoral dissertation. We presented this to the class, and then under Clarita Anderson's direction, we went on to publish an article in Dress. I had run 4 marathons. Well, yes, I would run 4 marathons in the course of my running career. I don't run anymore. So I did investigate the history of women's running wear, and this was published. So far, this is the only article I have published in Dress, however. Now, as to what I decided to research for my doctoral dissertation, I first considered looking at dyes in the 18th century, but then I was looking at a book at the Library of Congress, and it had samples of fabrics dyed with synthetic dyes in it, and those colors were just so vibrant. They glowed, and I said, oh, wow, this is something I really want to pursue. So I chose the years 1856 to 1891. I chose those years because 1856 was the year that William Henry Perkin discovered mauve, the first true synthetic dye, and I ended it in 1891 because that was the year that indigo was synthesized. Here you see William Henry Perkins' patent. I had to limit my research to silk and wool industry because the methodology I developed, I was trying to find out from how much dye companies purchased, how much fabric they could dye with that. If I'd gone into cotton, I would have had to look at calico printing, and I figured that methodology really wouldn't have worked very well because who knows how much you're using to print the calico. However, Judith Lopez, another CSA member, was actually researching madder and synthetic alizarin, which is the main coloring agent in madder, at the same time, and she was looking at calico printing. As one of the supporting things for my dissertation, I took courses from Dr. Helmut Schweppe. These were offered at the Conservation Analytical Laboratory of the Smithsonian Institution, which is out in Suitland, not too far from where I live. He would come every year. BASF sent him over. One year he would do identification of early synthetic dyes, and then the next year he would do natural dyes, and I took both those classes. Now, he had developed a method called thin layer chromatography, which requires you to use a known sample to which to compare the unknown that you're trying to identify. So we were provided with samples of many, many dyes, and we actually got to do some of the dyeing ourselves. And here you see two of the samples that we produced. The top one is mauve, William Henry Perkins mauve, and the bottom one is magenta. Now, that was developed by Wilhelm Hofmann. Wilhelm Hofmann was Perkins' professor, and so he built on Perkins' work to come up with magenta, and then other synthetic dyes followed. I did get a Sullivan Fellowship at the then Museum of American Textile History, which at that time was in Haverhill, that enabled me to go up to Haverhill and stay for several weeks and do research in their company records. And here you see an inventory from Amos Abbott Company of Dexter, Maine. This is an inventory of their dye house, but primarily I was using purchase records from different dye companies. And I finally got my degree in 1992, December.
Huzzah. So before and since then, you've worn many hats, including adjunct professor, costumer, reenactor, and retail management trainee. Can you walk us through those roles?
Okay. Well, I taught history of textiles as a teaching assistant. And then after I graduated, I taught history of costume. And I co-taught period styles in the Maryland Theater Department with set designer Dan Conway. He would teach interior design, architecture, and then I would do the costume section for the five. He divided it into 5 different eras that he covered. I taught a course in cross-cultural textiles in the Smithsonian Master of Decorative Arts program, and a couple of classes at Morgan State University, which is a historically Black university in Baltimore. My introduction to theater costume was when the University of Maryland shop manager went on maternity leave, and they had me fill in for her for the rest of the semester. And that led to my being hired as an overhire at the Washington Shakespeare Theater, where on the left you see I worked on Henry IV parts 1 and 2 with costume designer Tom Brucker, who also designed for Saturday Night Live, by the way. That was in 1994. Also in 1994, I worked at Arena Stage on the Odyssey with Paul Tazewell. And then I did freelance work at George Mason's Theater of the First Amendment. And this is how I met Howard Vincent Kurtz, our treasurer, who designed the show Faulkner's Bicycle. And I made the dress of the woman on the floor in the photograph.
Howard has joined us this evening.
Oh, good. He did join us. I wasn't sure he was going to be here. Oh, there you are, Howard. Hello. Yes, the yellow dress. He actually is the one who reminded me of the yellow dress. I had forgotten about it, and then I found the newspaper clipping to use for this. In retail, I worked at Hancock Fabrics. I started as a district home economist, but that was just a part-time job. And then the district manager enticed me to become a full-time manager trainee. But career-wise, I wasn't sure what I wanted, but I knew I hadn't found it yet. Living history or reenacting was more of an avocation, although I would be able to weave it into my career, and there will be more on that later. I began in 1996 after I was a volunteer at Riversdale, and again, I'm going to talk about that more in just a bit, when I made early 19th century outfits to wear to period dinners. I volunteered in the Living History program at Fort McHenry. That's the 3 ladies you see up at the top. That's me, along with Kelly Miller and Diana Buck. We mostly did interpretation of washerwomen. We would actually wash the shirts that the soldier reenactors had worn the week before. They would take off their dirty shirts, put them in the laundry basket, and we'd come the next week and do laundry. I really found this to be one of the most rewarding interpretations I've ever done, because I think it really brought home to people just how different life was in the early 19th century. We'd haul the water, of course, not from a well, from a faucet, but we hauled the water in buckets on a yoke, and we built the fire, although I never did. was never able to start with flint and steel, but Diana was good at that. Diana would split the wood too. And then we'd get the water hot and we'd do the washing and rinsing. On the left, you see I was involved with the War of 1812 bicentennial celebration. Of course, War of 1812 was 2012, but they started early, started in the early 2000s, trying to get the act together, get the state together. So here you see I wrote an article on what to wear for the Sails and Oars newsletter, and there's my husband and me in outfits at Riversdale. Down in the center bottom, you see we're at the opening of Alden O'Brien's wonderful exhibit, Agreeable Tyrant, at the Daughters of the American Revolution Museum. That's Carol Koshin and my husband Jim, along with me. And on the right, you see a group of us who were commemorating in 2015, the Treaty of Ghent commemoration at the Octagon House. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the War of 1812, was actually signed at the Octagon House by President Madison in February of 2015.
That is quite a handsome group there on the stairs. So you were affiliated with Riversdale in Maryland for almost 2 decades. Tell us about that historic house and your work there.
It actually is more than 2 decades if you count my time as a volunteer. Riversdale is a historic house museum of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission in the Department and the Parks of Recreation in Prince George's County. This is a separate entity from county government, but it is also supported by property taxes. And Riversdale is managed by the Natural and Historical Resources Division. So that also includes nature centers as well as historic sites. Here in this picture, I think I am interpreting very well both aspects of the division, since I am posing with a kayak. That was at an open house and now I need to tell you the story of Riversdale. I'll try to be brief, but it's such a wonderful story. There you see a great aerial view of the south front, and then in the other picture you see the north front. Henri Joseph Stier and his family fled the French Revolutionary forces marching on Antwerp in 1793. They came to the US, first to Philadelphia, and then they moved to Annapolis. And there, their daughter, Rosalie Eugenie, who was then a teenager, met George Calvert, who was of the founding family of Maryland. His father was actually an illegitimate son of the 5th Lord Baltimore, who he sent to the United States, I guess, because it was kind of embarrassing to have him around in England. But he did acknowledge him and allowed him to use the Calvert name. And he also married his Calvert cousin, who was the sole heiress to her family's estate. So he did okay for himself. Rosalie and George began courting, and after some hesitation, Rosalie's father did give his consent to their marriage, and so they moved to George Calvert's plantation in Prince George's County. In 1801, Henri decided to invest in property outside the new federal city of Washington and began to have a house built. The town today is called Riverdale Park. And no, we don't know why it went from Riversdale to Riverdale. That's one of our great mysteries. Maybe someday someone will find out. So in 1803, the house was not quite finished, and conditions in Europe made it prudent for him to go back to Antwerp. So he gave the property and house to Rosalie. And she and George lived there the rest of their lives. They had 9 children, and she died there in 1821. Of those children, 4 died in childhood and 5 survived to adulthood. Rosalie's letters to her family back in Antwerp were preserved, and copies were obtained by the Riversdale Historical Society, which, by the way, dates back to 1976. And they were edited by Margaret Law Calcott and published as the book Mistress of Riversdale, seen here. Mrs. Calcott's husband, George, by the way, was on my dissertation committee at Maryland. This book was yes, this book was actually given to me as a birthday gift, and it made me interested in volunteering at the house. The house had opened to the public in 1992, and I joined the second docent class in 1993. Volunteers mostly gave tours, and I did work some special programs, such as the annual War of 1812 encampment that began in 1996. By the fall of 1996, Prince George's County's tricentennial had some extra positions available. and I got a part-time position. I worked on exhibits and programs at Riversdale, and I also did school outreach. And finally, I got a career position in 2001. Mrs. Calvert's letters provide a rich source of interpretation. Through the years, we've supplemented this, of course, with other research. Oh, by the way, I should tell you, my official title was History/Museum Specialist. I just think that's a great bureaucratic title. So I did a lot of
a title with a slash in it.
yes. So I did do a lot of research. I helped run programs, helped do exhibits. We have a great curator, Jennifer Flood. She and I worked very well together once she came aboard on exhibits. But I also had to do lots of bureaucratic paperwork as well. That's the breaks. A cache of papers was found when one of the Calvert descendants died over a decade ago, and they've been gone through by a group, and they helped continue the Riversdale story past the time of the book. So we now have more primary source material to use. And I say we because I am going to keep some association with the house, probably do some volunteering in my retirement. I did retire in the end of August 2019.
After over 2 decades, it's hard not to say we, even if you weren't still going back.
Edward Day, who became the director of Riversdale in 1996, was always aware that we had multiple stories to tell, among them women's history. Hattie Caraway, who was the first woman elected to the Senate to actually serve any time at all, lived there for a while. We also have military history, agricultural history. Charles Benedict Calvert, the son of George and Rosalie, second son of George and Rosalie, who stayed on at the plantation. His brother didn't want to be a farmer, was into very much into scientific agriculture, and he actually helped found the University of Maryland, which started as the Maryland Agricultural College. So we have that a very close relationship with the University of Maryland. Of course, we also study decorative arts. Through the years, we've acquired quite a collection. Many are pieces that have come back to the family, although others are pieces of the period, not original to the house, but that have been acquired through generous donations, through fundraising and other ways. And it continues to grow. Just got some other beautiful things within the past year. But of course, we also do have to be very much aware of our African American history, because there were enslaved persons at Riversdale. There was also at least one free man of color we found from those later records that came to light. There were several white servants and even an indentured German gardener. Mrs. Calvert does mention some of the enslaved persons by name or position in her letters. We can speculate on some of their duties, which we've illustrated in various exhibits. And here you see some of those. Mrs. Calvert did have a butter business that provided needed cash. We do hope to restore the dairy someday, but in the meantime, we have set up this exhibit in the basement from time to time. These are all temporary exhibits. And outlines of a wash house have been found out on the property. Let me just show you again that picture, the aerial. See the aerial view where there's one building left, one outbuilding, which we just call the dependency because we don't know what it was used for. To the north of that was an outline with some more buildings, one of which they're almost certain was a wash house. So we also set up a laundry exhibit there. And while we're not sure, it's likely that some of the enslaved women did these chores, among others. We've also researched life of enslaved families at other sites. And this scenario, the large scenario here you see, is based on some of that research. One of the enslaved men at Riversdale was Adam Francis Plummer. He came to Riversdale in 1829 when he was a boy. He married Emily Saunders Plummer, who was an enslaved woman from another plantation in 1841. However, they did not live together, but she was close enough that he was able to see her from sundown on Saturday until sunup on Monday morning. But she was forcibly moved several times and eventually ended at Mount Hebron in Howard County, Maryland. She liberated herself in late 1863 and was finally able to be united with her husband. It's because of her action that Riversdale is a site of interest on the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, whose logo you see here. All of the enslaved persons in Maryland were freed by a new state constitution in 1864. After that, Adam Plummer stayed on as a paid foreman until he could buy his own land and build a house on it nearby. One of his daughters, Nellie Arnold Plummer, wrote about her family in Out of the Depths or the Triumph of the Cross, published in the 1920s. Descendants of the family are involved to this day. I have worked closely through the years with the de facto patriarch of the family, the Reverend Jerome Fowler, and also Dr. Lee Ryan. Dr. Ryan taught English for many years at the University of Maryland, but she also took an intense interest in the Plummer family. And we actually worked on a very large exhibit. This is just part of it, a temporary exhibit that told about as complete a story as we've ever been able to tell of the Plumbers, their surviving children, and what happened from slavery to freedom. There are small permanent exhibits about the family and other enslaved people in the Restored Dependency and the Visitor Center. And I understand that they are now in the process of establishing another exhibit, again, that tells more about the other enslaved people who live there as more information about them continues to come to light.
So there are other kinds of activities that you do at Riversdale too, all sorts of different programs.
I had an opportunity to stretch my research skills. I was asked to write an article for the 53rd Washington, but she wanted illustrated articles. Mrs. Calvert and her father shared a love of gardening, and there's much about it in her letters, but how was I to provide illustrations from a garden that was no longer there? Well, I found plates of flowers Mrs. Calvert mentioned in Curtis's Botanical Magazine in the collection of the National Agriculture Library in nearby Beltsville, Maryland, and they very kindly gave us permission to publish them. And here you see one, a tulip with a sprout. Her father was especially fond of tulips, of course, coming from the Low Countries. That's to be expected. Another exhibit we did was called Mr. Morse and the Iron Horse. Our part-time worker, Mary Naden, was very good at coming up with catchy names like that. The Washington branch of the B&O Railroad went through Riversdale in the late 1830s. And the first telegraph line in 1844 ran along that Washington branch. Not only did Samuel F.B. Morse envision the telegraph, he hired a man named Ezra Cornell to help to actually install it. Ezra Cornell came up with a machine that would lay the cable underground, but that did not work well, so they ended up stringing it up. But Ezra Cornell would go on to found agricultural college in New York State, Cornell University. And we were very grateful that we had a volunteer who had ties to Cornell, who provided us with copies of some of Ezra Cornell's papers, including a letter addressed to him at Riversdale. And
Excellent.
what you see here is a map of the Washington branch of the B&O Railroad.
And a fantastic portrait of Rosalie by Everett Stewart.
Oh, yes. Yes, he actually came out to Riversdale for 2 weeks to paint those, and she's wearing black because unfortunately her mother died not long after they returned to Antwerp. Some perennial favorite programs that I've helped develop include an annual 12th night ball with my husband Jim as the dance master. And on the right, reflecting Mrs. Calvert's Belgian heritage, we pay homage to St. Nicholas near his feast day every year. This is morphed in several different forms, most recently with a breakfast where we feature, of course, Belgian waffles. And here I am with Catherine Spivey, who has portrayed Mrs. Calvert for many years, and in the middle, our third, St. Nicholas.
So, Anne, were you responsible for St. Nicholas's garb?
Yes, I was. The first year we had St. Nicholas come, we borrowed an outfit from the Belgian American Friendship Club. But then in 2005, when Costume Society of America met in Philadelphia, I made a trip down to 4th Street, the textile fabric district, and I bought some red damask and red fake linen and the off-white, and I made him the outfit. Or, well, several different St. Nicholases, as I said, have worn it now.
CSA conferences, symposia get you to fabulous places to do wonderful things besides just hear lectures. The shopping is often good too.
Buying fabric, yes. I try to always seek out fabric stores where I go, not just for CSA events.
Right.
Okay, let's
So
see.
it looks like your research has covered so many topics, both from dress history and other things. In addition to the topics you've already mentioned, they include what women wore when they were traveling and living in foreign climes and Regency dress construction techniques. Would you describe a few other of these in greater detail and tell us if there's a common thread that runs through them?
Okay. I'm going to show a few slides from some representative programs I've done, both at Riversdale and for other groups. It's also loosely considered English Regency, so we bring in the Jane Austen people, as Kristen knows, since she's involved with the Jane Austen Society of North America as well. I really enjoy the challenge of seeking out multiple primary sources to tell a story, and sometimes this involves digging rather deeply to find or get to the origins of a source, a challenge that can pull me down a rabbit hole. This is the current iteration of Federal Style in the Federal City, which I first put together in 2000 for the CSA Northeastern Region program on Federal Style in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. This, by the way, is where I met Ned Lazaro. I don't know if Ned's with us tonight, who was there with his advisor, Pat Warner, who'd also become a good friend through the years. This included various personalities in federal Washington, including the Calverts, with portraits, letters, diaries, newspaper ads, extant garments. And here you see the correspondence between Dolly Madison and Elizabeth Bonaparte, who was living in Baltimore and offered to do some shopping for her. I have to say, I was really glad when we could switch from slides to PowerPoint. That made these kinds of composite pictures possible instead of just showing a slide of Dolly and then a slide of this and a slide of that. And new information does keep coming to light on this topic, which I can incorporate. I've given it several times since, and each time it has a little bit more information in it. I did a presentation for the Louisville Jane Austen Festival in 2018. This was called Shopping in Bath with Anne Elliot and Friends from the book Persuasion. And I used quotes from the book. This particular slide involves Anne's father, Sir Walter, who was pondering how was her sister Mary looking. If I thought it would not tempt her to go out in short winds and grow coarse, I would send her a new hat and pelisse. Anne was considering, however, whether she should venture to suggest that a gown or a cap would not be liable to any such misuse. So I found some nice pictures of morning gowns, caps, and an advertisement from the Bath Chronicle. I've done quite a bit of work now on the shops in Bath. I've done several presentations, some based on Northanger Abbey, and I love searching through the Bath Chronicle, finding ads. I thought of these as a charming morning gown and cap for Mary. If you remember, Mary was kind of a hypochondriac, and she used to, quote, lie on the faded sofa in her pretty little drawing room. This was part of a multi-phase project in how American women found out about European fashion. Here we see Harriet Manigault's diary and her reference to the British publication La Belle Assemblée, which she called Belle Assemblies. One of the rabbit holes I went down, although it took me a while to find the answer, what Mrs. Dashkoff, the wife of the Russian minister's full name was. That's Mrs. Andrei Dashkoff was the Russian minister, but he would summer outside of Philadelphia, and that's how Harriet Manigault met them. But as I said, it took me years to find out what Mrs. Dashkoff's name was. Of course, part of the problem was how she spelled Dashkoff. Here's how you spell Dashkoff. He was Andrei Dashkoff, and she was Yevgenia, or translated as Eugenia Dashkova. And I finally found her name, and yes, Gilbert Stuart painted her too.
He painted everyone.
I don't know if he did this in Washington or in Philadelphia, but yes, there for a while, anybody who was anybody in Washington got their portrait painted by Gilbert Stuart, that's for sure. And then later he moved to Boston. In 2018, Ned Lazaro, who's now at Deerfield, asked me to do a presentation for his symposium called Fashion and Conflict. Well, back in the 1990s, or when I was a volunteer at Fort McHenry, I got interested in privateers. They used to do a privateer auction every year for part of their War of 1812 commemoration. Baltimore, of course, was known as being a nest of pirates, sent a lot of privateers out. One thing I had long wanted to do was find the court records for some of the privateer cases. because privateering was not just piracy, it was legal. There was a legal process to be followed. And in the United States, it is the district courts that adjudicate privateer cases. So the ships will be sailed to the nearest port with a district court, and then they will present all their records. And if the court declares that it is a fair and legal prize, fair and lawful prize, excuse me, the goods would be auctioned off. This particular ship, the goods, Governor Tompkins, the goods were a cask of coral beads. She had left Malta. She had actually captured a ship that had just left Malta, and Malta at that time was a center for coral production. In fact, it still is. So I then went through the auction records and tried to find ads for people who had shops in New York. This particular one, this was the New York records. They're the only ones I found so far. They're on microfilm at the National Archives in Washington. I think they intended to microfilm all the records, but they evidently never got around to it. So one day I want to get up to Boston that still has the original records, not microfilm, and also Philadelphia, because the Baltimore records are in Philadelphia. So someday when the National Archives open again, I hope I can make visits there.
Someday. We're all very frustrated with archives and libraries being closed during COVID this year. It's been hard to get research done.
Now, these particular records, though, since they are in microfilm, also are online, but they're part of Ancestry.com. It's called Threefold, so you do have to pay, but at least you can access them. Fortunately, I didn't have to access them again for this research. I had enough copies to do what I needed, but I could if I had to. I reworked this presentation for the New York Symposium. It was called Sold in New York, since all of these records were the New York sales. Of course, I wasn't able to present that in New York, but if some of you may have been there when I did it was that last winter, I guess, last February? I did that as one of our online programs for the Mid-Atlantic region. So I did get to present this research after all. Now, my current research is the Gillen Project. This was a project launched by the Special Collections at the library at McGill University. Sometime in the 20th century, the Special Collections acquired the bird paintings of Elizabeth Gillen. She also painted there's other flora and fauna, but mainly birds. Elizabeth Gillen's husband, Sir Henry, was a judge who was sent out to Madras, which today is Chennai, by the East India Company in 1801. She went with him, and so did her unmarried sister, Mary. They wrote letters back to the family in England, which were kept. I'm still not exactly certain how they got kept or where they were found, but they're a wonderful catch. They were very sensitive and acute observers, and they wrote all sorts of things. They wrote about the food, they wrote about, of course, social life, but they also described some of the Indian rituals they saw. They described Indian dress. But one of the things that was of most interest to us costume historians is they also wrote asking their family to send them clothing from England that they could not readily get in Madras. And then once the clothing arrived, they wrote great descriptions of, oh, we got this and this is great, but this one doesn't quite work right. Next time, can you send this? So they were looking for a costume historian to work as part of this project. I think we're up to over 20 researchers, though, now from all around the world. There are people from India, people from Canada, people from Great Britain. But it was Tina Bates who recommended me to Victoria Dickinson, the head of the project. Thank you very much, Tina, if you're here. If not, somebody tell her. Thank you. And they've also gotten on board Alexandra Kim, who some of you might know because she's co-editor of Costume, the journal for the Costume Society of Great Britain. She works for the City of Toronto Museums. And then she found Tulika Gupta, who, let me make sure I get her title right for you, is the director of the Indian Institute of Crafts and Design. Now, we were supposed to go to Montreal last spring and, well, year before last, and present. We were going to be the first presenters, but of course that didn't happen. But we were still the first online presenters. So Alexandra and I had to present the whole story, set the groundwork, how Sir Henry got his title, their presentation at court, how they traveled out to the India on the East Indiaman, what the climate was like, and all of those wonderful things, besides then getting into the clothing. There is going to be a book coming out. We're doing one chapter of the book. They also have some online presence now, but this is an ongoing project. By the way, they got a huge grant from the Canadian government to make this possible. So look for more information on the Gwillums.
That's fascinating, Anne. What a fabulous project. So you just mentioned Tina Bates, who is our editor of Dress, our journal, and you've mentioned several other CSA members as well. Do you have any other CSA stories that you want to tell us about how it's been important to you in your career?
Oh, yes, indeed. I have some more pictures. I did, of course, go to the symposium in Washington, D.C. in 1990, but then the next one I was able to attend was 1998 in Pasadena. And we went on the post-symposium tour. We went to the Getty Museum, and here you see two of us at the Getty Museum. The Getty Museum had a room of children's things, including clothes. Well, we could not resist trying on the children's costumes. Unfortunately, the law in California didn't allow them to have hats, because these two pictures had great hats too, but we didn't have any hats to try on. But that stuck in my mind as a great idea. So when I did a dress exhibit at Riversdale, I designed a set of children's clothes, and some volunteers helped me actually stitch them. And here in the picture, you see me putting a girl into one of them. I too based mine on actual portraits. The picture you see there is one of John Lewis Crimmel's picture. She's an unidentified woman. And then on the right, you see part of the exhibit set up in the dining room. We did borrow period pieces, including things from Mary Deering. The white dress there is from Mary. Mary has been a strong supporter of small museums through the years, lending garments either for exhibits or for study days. She's just always been so generous. And also, though, we supplemented the actual pieces by holding a costume contest, and we had people submit entries to be on display. And Newbie Richardson was actually one of the entrants. So she's another one of those people who I've met through the years.
Another CSA member. And Mary Deering is the first recipient and the namesake of a new Guardian Award to honor those who have helped take care of collections and shared them with the public and with our field.
Correct. And unfortunately, she had a severe stroke a few years ago. She is bedridden now, but her collection is in the custody of Colonial Williamsburg, and they are planning a major exhibit to come out next year to honor her. We're all looking forward to seeing that. I have done a couple of research exhibits, well, more than that, actually. I've actually done 6 of them, but these are 2 of the research exhibits I did at Riversdale, or at Costume Society, and based in Riversdale. The one on the upper left was done at Williamsburg in 2000, and this actually uses the material in Rosalie Steer Calvert's book, Mistress of Riversdale, describing all of the clothes that her sister sent from Antwerp when her daughter, who's the little girl in the picture, turned 18 and was going to be introduced into Washington society. The one on the lower left is one I did in 2019, again in Williamsburg. So these are kind of bookends. This was to show many different ways that I have run across through the years how American women found out about European fashion. Being sent fashion plates from family and friends, reading about things in newspapers, and different ways like that. When my boss at Riversdale saw this, he said, we need to do a big size exhibit. And here you see some of the graphics. One of the advantages of working for Riversdale is we had a great graphics design staff that we could call on, and they loved projects like this. You see the lady in red, she's a stand-up figure, so you could pose for selfies with her. I also took advantage of the opportunity to add to my collection of French fashion plates, which you see in the case, because we do know that Rosalie Steer Calvert's sister sent her fashion plates. She could cut them out. She said, if you cut them out and fold them up in a letter, you can send them that way. And her sister did. Oh, and there you see, that's our curator, Jennifer Flood's reflection in the glass taking the picture. As I said, she's been great to work with through the years. Of course, you know, I'm the parliamentarian. Elizabeth Brown got me into that. She was parliamentarian for many years. And so I rely heavily on my Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised 11th edition. I've also done some special projects. I guess that was 2009 I started it, and this is a draft 2010. When Barbara Brudeau was president, she asked me to work on this document clarifying the regional-national relationship, and I understand that's something Kristen wants to revisit. So we were glad when we could dig this out. I didn't know I still had it on my computer. Barbara finally found it on hers, but I found it on mine too. I was a Stella Blum Student Research Grant Chair for many years. I think it's 14, although I'm not positive. I was a juror before that. I didn't always help the awardees with their journal articles for dress, but sometimes I did. And this one is Jennifer Farley Gordon's on Joseph Love, the children's wear firm that I did help her get ready for publication. And I also did in 2005 in Philadelphia initiate what we decided to call Living History Showcase. I know we did it in 2006 in Hartford, where I think we did an actual stage show, and then we did it the next year in Atlanta. And Kristen says, there she is in the middle, that this was her first symposium with us.
It was.
You also see Karen Bolecki in the American Civil War dress. Karen is at Shippensburg Fashion, what do they call it? Fashion Archives. And she has also been very supportive through the years. She does great programs there. And she has also loaned things to us at Riversdale and also shared her expertise on dressing mannequins on a shoestring. And we've used that. And then I understand Mela Hayden is here tonight. There she is on the right, another one of our living history people. And I'm sorry, I don't remember who the two people on the left are. If either of you are here, you can identify yourselves. I really, the Living History Showcase just kind of tapered off. I really kind of like to see it instituted again. I've long wanted to get reenactors more interested in membership in Costume Society of America, but it's been kind of an uphill fight. Sometimes I try to make them aware of the kinds of advantages I've had, things like behind the scenes looks in collections. I mentioned that symposium we went to in Portsmouth. We got to see in the Strawberry Bank collection. When we were in Hartford, we got to see the Massapequa, is it? Indian Museum collection. So it's just been an excellent opportunity through the years. And I do need to mention a few other people. I couldn't go into all of the stories, but I do want to just read a few more names, people that have helped me through the years. Lynn Bassett actually got me involved with the book publication. Actually, that's an interesting story. She was telling people about it at Providence Symposium. And I thought, oh, that sounds neat. Well, I didn't get chosen. She tapped somebody else. But that person decided she couldn't do it. So I was the first runner-up, which is a very important position if Miss America cannot fulfill her duties. So I ended up writing that book. And actually, Lynn ended up withdrawing from it as well. She was going to write the second part, and she ended up withdrawing too. Colleen Callahan, Cynthia Cooper, Mark Hutter, Claudia Kidwell. These are in alphabetical order, by the way. Sarah Marchetti, Sally Queen, and we already mentioned Newbie Richardson, to name a few. And I will close with these. In 2005, the CSA Executive Committee met in Northern Virginia, and they came to Riversdale, where they tried on many of the reproduction hats I had in my early 19th century millinery shop. And let's see if I can get this to work. I'm going to try something here. That is West Virginia Southeastern Regional Meeting in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia in 1998, where we did dress in our period finery, and after a stint of period dancing in our period attire, we took to the floor with Alden O'Brien there in the front, leading the way to Jim's contemporary calling and the then hottest dance craze, the Macarena.
That 90s dance craze. Thanks so much, Anne. That was a fascinating look through your career and all of your excellent research. So do you have any other research topics that you're working on besides the one that you're doing for the Canadian group?
Actually, I need to make a 1790 ensembles for Jim and me. I've never done that period, but he has been tapped to do a Marie Antoinette ball. And I decided rather than doing full-blown 1770s or 1780s, I'd slide in at the very end of her period, 1789, 1790. So I have all the fabric here and the patterns here waiting. I just need to plunge in and get going.
That's exciting. Anne, thank you so much for spending the evening with us tonight and for showing us what all the fascinating, exciting things you've done throughout the years. And we look forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for asking me. I was very honored. I did see Betty Wass here, I have to say. Of course, Betty Wass. I don't know if I ever told you, when I first started at the University of Maryland, the chair, Dr. Betty Smith, had, of course, known Betty Wass for many years, and so she used to call me Betty.
Two Wasses, it's very confusing. Well, thank you to both Wasses this evening. Thank you to all the Wasses, James, who helped us with the AV as well. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming.